I'll be the first one to admit that the title is a little bit clickbait because the OM 5 doesn't even have ISO 100 unless you go into the extended part of the ISO. The base ISO of the OM 5 is actually 200. ISO is usually one of the first things that beginners hear about, paired with advice like, never raise it, high ISO means noise. But here's the truth. The real goal should be to expose your photo properly, and more often than not, that means stepping away from base ISO. Hi everybody and welcome back to a new video. I'm Jimmy, a hobby enthusiast photographer based in Sweden, and in today's video we're diving into something practical, something that can genuinely make your life easier, auto ISO. And stick around because I will show you exactly how I set it up on my OM 5. I'll start by explaining how I use auto ISO for my photography. I mainly shoot in aperture mode, which means I decide how much depth of field I want in the photo. Now, my photography doesn't really rely on a shallow depth of field, which means I don't chase that creamy background blur, also known as bokeh. That means I can use aperture more flexibly, adjusting it to control how much light hits the sensor instead of letting the ISO ramp up too quickly. But aside of auto ISO, I also use something really important, which is a minimum shutter speed, which I set depending on the conditions I'm photographing in. And don't worry, I will show you exactly how I set this up later in the video. For example, on a cloudy day, sunrise, sunset, or even at night, there's obviously less light available. So if I'm out in the streets photographing people, I might use a minimum shutter speed of 1/250th or 1/500th of a second to freeze the action. In that case, auto ISO will bump that ISO up to keep the exposure level even. Same scenario, but a super sunny day, well, like now, well, the ISO stays low. Auto ISO keeps that ISO as low as it possibly can. So how do you actually use auto ISO to your advantage? Well, one way is to go fully manual, but with auto ISO turned on. That way you decide the depth of field in the scene and how fast the scene gets captured by your camera. And now you're probably thinking, so Jimmy, what are we doing here? Here's how I see it. When I'm out photographing, I don't want to think about the camera settings too much. I want the camera to feel like an extension of my eyes and vision. And the easier it is to take the photo, the better. This means that when I arrive at a location, I just take a look around. I check how much movement there is. Trees swaying, people walking, water splashing ashore. I get a feel of the scene. Then I choose a minimum shutter speed that I'm comfortable with, something that will freeze the movement in the environment. But that's just how I use it, based on the kind of photography I do. Now, take landscape photographers, for example. I'd say they benefit the least from using auto ISO, at least most of the time. You're often working on a tripod and the scene isn't going anywhere. And you usually want the cleanest file possible, which means keeping the ISO as low as it can go. That said, chasing the lowest ISO by using a slower shutter speed can backfire if there is any movement in the scene. Trees blowing in the wind, water flowing, even fast-moving clouds. All of that can cause motion blur, and sometimes that's just not what you want. But the big difference here is landscape photographers usually have the time. You can afford to adjust your settings manually and double-check the results. So auto ISO may not be as useful as it is for other type of photography where things are happening faster. And then there's wildlife photography. Personally, I don't shoot wildlife unless you count my cats. But if I did, I'd definitely want to control both my aperture, my depth of field, and the shutter speed. And that's where manual with auto ISO really comes in hand. You lock in a fast shutter speed and you decide the depth of field and just let the auto ISO fix the rest. On the OM5, you can set your ISO range and minimum shutter speed by going to menu, cogwheel E1. And here's how I have mine set up. So I choose a upper limit of 6-400 and the default base one is 200. This sets the boundaries for how much the camera can adjust ISO when auto ISO is enabled. It'll try to stay at ISO 200, but it can go up to 6400 if needed to maintain a proper exposure. And if we just move back once in the menu by pressing the menu button, we can now set the minimum shutter speed as well. So for today's photography, I've chosen a minimum of 1/250th of a second. And this tells the camera, don't go slower than that, unless absolutely necessary. It will hold that shutter speed and adjust the ISO to compensate for changing light. But if it gets too dark and the ISO maxes out, then and only then will shutter speed start to decrease. I mentioned in the beginning that ISO often gets a bad reputation, and comments about how high ISO often creates more noise. And while there is some truth to that, it's not the complete story. But here's the thing, proper exposure matters more. A well-exposed image at ISO 1600 is gonna look way better than a underexposed photo at ISO 200 that you then have to brighten up in post. Let me show you what I mean. This photo was taken at ISO 1600, but properly exposed in camera. There's a bit of grain, sure, but the details is there, contrast looks great, and it's totally usable. Now, here's the same scene shot at ISO 200, but underexposed by a few stops and then brightened in post. The result? Muddy shadows, more noise, and a loss of overall image quality. Yeah, but Jimmy, that was only ISO 1600. I hear you. Let's take it a step further. This next photo was shot at ISO 3200, again properly exposed in camera, and even at that level it holds up surprisingly well. There's more visible grain, but it's clean, consistent, and the image still looks sharp. Let's look at them side by side. On the left, ISO 3200, properly exposed. On the right, ISO 200, underexposed and brightened. You can clearly see the difference. The properly exposed image holds up, while the underexposed one loses color, detail and overall clarity. So yeah, low ISO can be really nice when the conditions allows it, but what matters more is getting the exposure right in camera, and that's exactly where auto ISO comes in. It helps you do exactly just that, but without you having to juggle your settings all the time. Okay, so auto ISO isn't perfect, and there are times when I completely turn it off and set my ISO for the scene. And the first one would be tripod work, such as landscapes or night photography. Those times I really want full control of all my settings. The scene isn't moving, so I've got time, and I want the absolute best image quality possible, which means keeping the ISO as low as possible. And the second one is under controlled lighting. If I'm indoors using artificial lights such as window light or LED panels, or anything consistent, I don't want the camera to change ISO on me between shots. I lock it in to keep all my photos and videos evenly exposed and color consistent, especially when recording videos. And the third one is long exposures. If I'm doing long exposures, I don't want auto ISO to keep changing all the time. So yeah, auto ISO is super helpful in most of my photography, but not always. There are times when going full manual makes complete sense. Auto ISO isn't a beginner's crutch. It's a tool, and like any tool, when used intentionally, it becomes a part of your workflow. So if you've been avoiding it because of fear of noise and loss of control, Give it a shot. Set your boundaries and see what it frees you up to focus on. I want to thank today's sponsor, Freewell. They have been kind enough to send me their new hybrid magnetic filter, the V2 magnetic variable ND and CPL filter, which covers 3 to 7 stops of light reduction. When I shoot these videos, I heavily rely on ND filters because often I shoot with a pretty open aperture and a pretty slow shutter speed, which means even at ISO 200, I let in a lot of light to the camera. And without an ND filter, I would look like this. Yeah, not as pleasant. This filter blocks just the right amount of light, but it's not only an ND filter, it's also a CPL filter, which means it cuts out reflections. Not just in water, but also on leaves, on windows, and even wet pavement, giving your footage more pop and clarity. What I really love is the magnetic system. You screw in the base ring, which comes in various sizes, and the filter just snaps on. You turn the whole filter to adjust the CPL, and you lock it in place with these tiny screws to stay secure. But you can also stack other filters magnetically, like this snow mist filter they were kind to send me as well. Just pop it on, and that's it. It's super fast and it feels really solid, and it makes my shooting experience so much smoother. So a big thank you to Freewell for supporting this video. If you're interested of checking Freewell's gear up, I've included links down in the description. Thank you, Freewell. Do you use AutoISO? Love it? Hate it? Maybe never even touched it? Drop a comment down below and let me hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing. I appreciate it so much. But until next time, have a good day or evening whenever you're watching this. Out!